Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the Dutch Empire or the Netherlands and their approach to imperialism. I think that it's important to talk about the Netherlands and their colonial period just because not a lot of people know about it, and a lot of the economic systems that we have in place today came about as a result of their um, exceptional mercantilism and growth during the 17th and 18th century specifically. So when we first getting into it, I just kind of want to show a map. A lot of people don't realize how big such a small country, such as the Netherlands, is. You see it up in the European continent, that green area up there. That was the home base of the Netherlands. That was at the time it was called the United or the United Republic of the Seven Kingdoms of the Netherlands. I'm pretty sure. But see, you see all the way along Africa, the West Indies, and all the little Handelsposten. These are like little trading centers, so they weren't necessarily colonial hubs, but the whole purpose of Netherland imperialism, colonialism, was to make money, unlike the purposes of other countries where there was also glory and the prospect of spreading religion. Although they did do that, they did spread their religion in quite a few places. Now, a little contextual history. That strapping young man on the left right there is King Philip II of Spain. He was one of the Habsburgs. And so the Habsburgs had a dynastic control on many of the countries in Europe at the time. They were nearing the end of that dynasty at this period in time, at the late 1600s. Not quite over, but they were nearing the end. And so you can see his jaw. He's undeniably a Habsburg. They had that strong jaw due to inbreeding. But he was the reason why they eventually vied for independence in the first place. He was very oppressive to the peoples. They obviously most all peoples want their own nation, but he took it a little too far. During the years of religious wars, he went in there. He was a Catholic, and the Dutch tradition, the Calvinistic traditions of Protestantism were, they were the popular thing in Netherlands, and so he came in and he tried to suppress that, which eventually led to a bunch of different wars. It's actually known as the 80 Years' War, and it actually lasted a lot longer. The entirety of the war lasted a lot longer than the Republic officially declaring independence in 1581. Needless to say, that is when they centralized their government and set themselves apart as a separate nation and started acting as one. They immediately started looking all around Europe, Russia, the Levant, everywhere in the Mediterranean, all around the area, and then they wanted to look outward as well. And so a bunch of companies we don't know too much about. They don't have as much information on them, but they were all trying to do similar things, and they all came together and they formed the Dutch East India Trading Company, or what's going to be known as the VOC from here on, from out in the video. Don't ask me to try and pronounce the Dutch name. I would just butcher it, and it wouldn't sound like what it's supposed to anyway. So we'll just say the VOC in 1602 was founded officially. Now the VOC, that had this cool little emblem. They were originally formed because the Portuguese Empire had a monopoly on the spice trade in Asia, and so at this time, they're a new nation, and the people in the Netherlands are like, we can make some money over there, so we're going to send a bunch of people over there, and so they formed the company to go and do that. Now, this was a militaristic sort of a conquest. It was really just them asserting themselves in the area. The Portuguese Empire was already on the decline, so they came in and they kind of booted them out in traditional imperial fashion with ships and guns and a little bit of conquest. They're responsible for the Cape Colony in Africa, which we saw a few slides back on their map, in the South African region. Trading posts in India and Asia, so that whole stretch, all those orange Handelsposten, that was them. And Asia, especially in Japan, they were actually given a trading monopoly. They were allowed to, at first they were only allowed to trade on one island, but they were the only country that was allowed to deal with Japan legally. And then the Dutch East Indies, which is what they were most known for, and what the country, the Netherlands, held on to for the longest. Modern day Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, that area in Oceania. And they existed until 1799, when they were dissolved in 1800. Their territories were assumed by the government, by the kingdom of the Netherlands. Now, the West Indies Trading Company, they don't get a cool symbol because they're not really as important in the life of the Netherlands Empire. They are important for us as Americans because that's how we get New York, Pennsylvania, all that area, the northern part of the United States. In fact, one of their explorers, Henry Hudson, is actually what the Hudson River is named after, appropriately. And so that's where we get that from. It was actually, New York was originally known as New Amsterdam and New Netherlands, that area, the New Netherlands colony. And so then when the British bought it, they named it after the Duke of York. So they were playing the same way. In fact, they were in opposition. They wanted, because the East Indies Trading Company was a joint stock company, meaning it was public, anybody could, it wasn't in direct control by the crown, so anybody could make another company as long as they can get the backers for it, and they can go out and do something different. So they wanted to find a different way to the Indies, much like Christopher Columbus did several hundred years earlier. They wanted to find a different way. So that's why you have all the territories in Northern America, and you have territories on the southern part of South America near Tierra del Fuego and all that area. Responsible for the Dutch territories in the Caribbean, which the Dutch Antilles, most of that is still held by the Netherlands as a territory today. Northern American and Southern American colonies, what we just talked about, and trading posts in the West African coast, which I mentioned in the last slide. All those Handelsposten on the west coast of Africa, and the few smaller territories in that area due to the West Indies Trading Company. They began to decline influence rather rapidly, just because the other powers already had such a monopoly on the Americas and that area. They were kind of confined to the Caribbean. They had a few things going on for them here and there, but for the most part, they were kind of limited. They had to sell off parts of the land due to different reasons, just pressure, and they just weren't doing nearly as well as the East India Trading Company. They definitely didn't make as much of an impact in the long run, even though there are still territories being held over there. The competitors. So all around the world, these were their main competitors at one time or another, either economically or otherwise. And so the Portuguese, this is the Imperial Cross, and Spain, that is the Conquistadors flag, which has the Crown of Castile arms on it, which is the benefactor. See, most of these companies, even if they became joint stock companies, which is a publicly traded, publicly funded, publicly managed company later on, they were originally all run by the government. They were all under the funding or under the direct influence of the crown. So the imperial powers, such as these we see right here, most of their goals were a little bit different in its inception from the Netherlands, because the Netherlands didn't have any kind of need for conquest. They didn't have to go in there and conquer a bunch of land to fund their expenditures, as they were already funded back home. See, here you have the crown, who are levying taxes to pay for these ventures, and they expect capital return for that and profit. So obviously the Netherlands and the Dutch, they expected that as well, except they weren't tied to any crown, any government agency per se. At least not in the way that all these companies were in their originality. Now, a few of them eventually became joint stock companies, such as the East Indies Company of France, and the East India Company of England. Although the East India Company of England was always very militaristic. We got into the First Opium War earlier on. That all went downhill really quickly. in all of their ventures. Now, colonization. Obviously, they're a mercantile company, first and foremost, a joint stock company. So even though they are going to be doing some colonization, that wasn't their premier goal. Their premier goal was to make money. Um, and so while it was secondary, things still happened. The destruction of Jakarta, which was then became their central hub, Batavia or Batavia. I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. You're supposed to pronounce that. And then later on, in the same area in the Indies, in what is now known as Sumatra, which is also where modern day and older Jakarta is as well. Um, they had the Aceh or the Aceh pacification. Now I put that in quotations because it was really them going in there and taking out a lot of the locals. Remember, they are an imperial power. They do exert their strength. Dutch colonialism in the Antilles started from scratch, though. So in the East India, in the East Indies, they came in. There were people living there, but they were focused on mercantilism. So they came in and they kind of just set up shop, and they worked with a lot of the local um, governments and indigenous peoples when they felt like it. Let's just say it that way. And so, actually, a lot of the highland local natives, they called them, actually didn't mind the Dutch being there because they made it so that trade was never interrupted by means of stepping in and being the peacekeepers of that area. So the highland peoples who dealt in a lot of trade and everything, they actually liked their policing force there, and most of them were allowed to keep um, their culture. They were allowed to keep their influence in the area. There was except for the areas where they blatantly came in and conquested and conquered, there wasn't as much influence being exerted by the Dutch government and the East India Trading Company in the area. Because remember, there's a mercantile company. They're not funded exactly by the state, so they don't really always have a reason to go in there and claim things for the state as long as they're making money, you know? And so, since the Dutch imperial system was focused primarily on that trade, in the West Indies and in the East Indies, you kind of saw these local elites or the local natives or the previous immigrants to that area kind of stepping up and taking over instead of it being governed by the crown or a governing body appointed by the crown directly. So, Batavia. Um, Modern day Jakarta. This is an image drawn circa 1780, and this was, like I said, the center of the VOC of the Dutch East India Trading Company. This was kind of like their hub. It's supposed to have been a very multicultural city. At this point, when the Dutch got there, even though they booted the Portuguese out, much of the languages that were still being spoken was Portuguese and the native languages. So in the city, you had everywhere from Portuguese, you had Chinese, you had the Javanese, um, the Dutch. You had all kinds of people in there, and so it was a very metropolitan area, which is not something you hear about very often out in Asia, especially in Oceania. Um, but because the Dutch were focused on making money, they made it happen. And in fact, a lot of people, they actually transported from Java, from this area, to their West Indies territories as well. And so you have a lot of, even today, you go to places like Suriname, and you have a lot of Javanese people whose ancestors came from this area. And here you have a map of they actually still hold the island of Curacao, but it was kind of like their legal trading hub and the illegal trading hub in the Caribbean, in the Antilles. So this is circa 1836, and this was kind of where they did all their trading in the West Indies. So colonization and slavery, one of the big things that always comes up when you talk about colonization is always the evils of colonization. Uh, I've talked very highly thus far about the Dutch imperialism just because I think there's a lot there that we don't know about, and I'm going to get to more of that in a little while. But the one of the big banes of colonization and imperialism, the slavery, was still in effect That didn't go away with the East India Trading Company or the West India Trading Company. However, what was different is that, especially in the East India Trading Company in the VOC territories, slavery was actually a lot more lenient than it was with the locals. So in Asia, slavery existed. It existed in many different forms, everywhere from labor slavery to sexual slavery, all kinds of different ways that was gone about, and that existed before they got there, much like it did in Africa before the Europeans came in and started exporting slaves as well. So when the Dutch came in, they weren't really built on the backs of slaves. They were traders. They weren't, it wasn't a lot of plantations, so they didn't need a lot of labor slaves. And so really they needed people to help them out with their trading, moving boxes, going around and doing trade missions. And so really they were treated like servants more than slaves in many conditions. And then as time went on, since they weren't built on the backs of slaves, since they weren't foundationally a slave state, treatment of slaves got progressively better. At one point, England was in control of the West Indies territory, specifically the Indonesian territories. And so for that period of time, there was actually an anti-slavery program put into place. And then when the Netherlands reassumed control of that area, it got turned into more like a humanitarian society. However, slavery was still on the decline until they officially outlawed it until the 1860s. In the West Indian territories, slavery was common just because of the area that it was in. Um, it was expected that there were going to be slaves and that they were going to need them, and they did utilize them, especially in Suriname, where there was a big plantation corporation and enterprise going on. But it wasn't like they were still foundational. They weren't necessary to the trading that they were doing, because a lot of their money didn't come from raw ingredients being exported back to the country. It did, although it wasn't built on that like the other empires, like England was, or France, where they would take these raw ingredients and that was like the soul of their business. They would come back to the mainland, and from the mainland they would be traded out. No, the Dutch did a lot of trading on their own. Since they were a company, they didn't always come back to the mainland, so they kind of just did their trading as they pleased. And so since slavery wasn't essential to that system, it kind of just died out itself up until the beginning of the 18th century as well. So in the 18th and 19th century, you see slavery go away with almost completely in the East Indian and the West Indian territories. So what was different from the East India Company, the West India Trading Company? What was different about the Netherlands approach to imperialism and colonialism from all the other countries? Well, the first thing is that their colonizing forces, were joint stock companies. They're founded as a publicly traded company. Think of Apple. In fact, we're going to get to that in a second. Think of Apple on the stock market now. That is how these companies worked, and it actually worked out great for them. And so many good things about our modern day economy came as a secondary implicit nature from the original associations that these companies made, specifically the East India Trading Company. So mercantilism, as opposed to conquest, they didn't go in and immediately try to oust the natives. They did. I'm not going to make any excuses for them, but they weren't nearly as bad as the other conquesting powers like England or Spain. Liquidity of stock, and that was important, and we're going to get into that in just a few seconds, as well as the development of early paper money system in the form of IOUs, which eventually led to banknotes. And all of these things together, the fact that it was a publicly traded company and that they were able to share or to sell shares of their company so that they could get funding because they weren't being funded by the crown, it meant that everybody who owned a piece of that could levy that and could use that as as a form of currency in and of itself. They could use that as a tradable good. And so this is really when we see the first evolution of a secondary market, which is where the value of companies, values of entities, not just products of entities, are traded in a monetary system. And what does that give you? That gives you credit. It gives you the ability to levy your resources against the value of a company, right? And this, from day one, was what was so fantastic about the East India Trading Company, especially the day one, the first month that it was started. It was since it was the accumulation of a few already well funded and established companies that were smaller, but they came together to form this new venture. And so, in and of itself, right then and there, the stock, the capabilities, the speculations for the value of that company was shot straight up. And a Spanish force who had captured some Dutch prisoners were paid off with shares from the Dutch East India Company to reclaim those prisoners they had captured. Because remember, at this time, the 80 Years' War is still going on. They're still going to war with Spain. However, that Spanish official, that Spanish individual, recognized the value of this brand spanking new company just because of speculation and because of the kind of value that it presented itself to lean towards. And so that has a lot of big things. In fact, big implications. In fact, it ended up being that the Netherlands, at the dawn of the 18th century, the 17th century, much of the 17th century, was the premier economic power in Europe. And because of that, we have um, a, a few years ago, Business Insider did this comparison, and they looked at Apple stocks, a few other stocks today, and they looked. Now, South Sea Company, Mississippi Company, they're a little bit different, but the Dutch East India Company, a real business that was focused on capitalism, mercantilism, albeit some violent conquest as well, but the solid nature, the solid organization and tactics of the company, the value of its company today would greatly outshine, in today's money, any company on the earth today. It is the company to look at as a role model. Now, the Mississippi Company and the South Sea Company, they're a little bit different. So the Mississippi Company was run by France, and the South Sea Company was run by England. And you might have heard of the South Sea Bubble, um, or the Mississippi Company bubble, and that is a direct result of how they were formed. Now, in the Dutch East India Company, it was funded by trade, and then it was sold off. Right, it was sold in shares to be able to fund itself, and they set specific requirements on that to build credit for the company. They said if you're going to buy a share, you owe us a certain amount of money for the first 10 years. And so immediately off the bat, those shares were worth something because they had value. And when you traded those shares, the person who you traded them to, they agreed to pay the value of that 10-year price to the company. All right, so there was always growth from the very start. Well, the South Sea Company and the Mississippi Company, they were used to accumulate, to pretty much consolidate and prop up debt, and then through insider trading and speculation, prop up the price of those shares to then pay off the debt. However, what do you have when both prices are constantly going up? You're going to have an ever-rising debt, and you're also going to have an ever-rising share price. And so those ended up in great economic collapses. Fun fact, Isaac Newton lost what today would be $3 million in the South Sea bubble. So that was bad. The guy who was responsible for those is John Law. He worked in tandem with An English lord to set up the South Sea Company ended up going to bubble. And the same thing with the Mississippi Company. He worked with King Louis of France to set that up as well, where it was his ideas at least. And so, well, at first glance, this guy, he might not look like a great guy. He caused two of the greatest economic collapses in recent history. Not talking about the Great Depression or anything in modern history, but in recent history, relatively recent history. But these ideas were new. Keep that in mind. The Dutch and the Swedish, that area was the first area in the world to do something like that. So this guy John Law comes in and he starts writing it all down. He starts figuring it out. How do they create such a booming economy? Well, credit. And so he set up a viable system of that. He proposed a viable system to that. He proposed national banks to regulate banknotes and to dismiss and to administer and give out banknotes so that money is no longer tied to a coin or a precious metal. So all these things, he kind of systematized them. He created a systematic economic proposal which propelled our nation or our world really into the future, even if he did cause two of the greatest economic catastrophes along the way. He was a great guy. You should look him up a little bit. So, us setting aside the great economic legacy that we have from the Dutch East India Company, there is also the great travesty and catastrophic legacy of an imperial power as well that we're all too familiar with, decolonization, the fight for independence, etc., something that our country has had to go through itself. And even though things weren't as bad in the Dutch East Indies, is still an economic power or an imperial power, and it still led to imperial rule when the companies were dissolved and the governments assumed control of those territories. So the many territories didn't gain independence until the 20th century, until after World War II, such as Indonesia, or in the mid 70s, Suriname, which used to be Dutch Guyana, I believe, in South America. So all in all, there are benefits to the systems that the Dutch put in place. And even though there are bad things that happen about it, there are war crimes. There is almost an entire extermination of an island of indigenous people is wrapped up in the Dutch East Indies history. However, let's also not forget that we can't change the past, and what they gave us was great. And we can use those tools to prop up other countries out there through the use of things like credit and of great systems of mercantilism, paper money. I mean, that revolutionized the world in and of itself. So even though there were a lot of bad things that came out of it, there are also a lot of good things that came out of it. A lot of things that people use today, and they don't even think about it being attached to the Dutch Empire or to the Netherlands at all. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose to do this project on the Dutch colonial empire. It's just because I feel like we all need to take a step back and actually look at how we got where we are, why we are what we are, if there's anything we can do about it, and then take the good and try and fix the bad. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.